Open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 18, as we continue our study in this first gospel in the New Testament. In our last study, we got through verse 14, where Jesus talked about how it is natural that someone would leave 99 sheep to go rescue the one that was lost, because in that moment, the most urgent matter is about rescue. And so the rest of this chapter, verse 12 to the end, is about how to rescue one another. It's about rescuing and healing relationships. We say that because sometimes the paragraph that begins in verse 15 is taken out of context, or perhaps without regard to the tone of the context, and we call this the church discipline passage. How to punish somebody, or maybe even how to run them off. But what's important to note is the paragraph before this teaching is about the urgency that the shepherd has to go and rescue that hurting sheep or lost sheep before it's too late. And then it's followed by, in verse 21, Peter asking how many times does he have to forgive his brother? And forgiveness is what allows relationships to heal and to be redeemed. So after telling them about the urgent shepherd's business of rescuing lost sheep, then Jesus says in verse 15, if your brother sins. Now, why does that matter? Well, so he uses a non-emotional illustration about sheep to illustrate a principle. The one who's lost, the one who's separated, the one who's hurting, the one who's in trouble is the one that needs your attention. And so now that he's kind of laid a general concept, you might even argue an obvious concept, now it's time to apply that where it matters most, and that's in our relationships with each other. So, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. Now, the key seems to be that you have won your brother. So this is not about simply judgment. It's not about just correction. It's not about making sure people know what their mistakes are. Some of that certainly may be involved, but the project here, he says, so that you have won your brother, that's the goal. Anytime that we approach confrontation for some other reason, then it's not going to be a healthy process. Flip over to Galatians chapter 6 real quick. Galatians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul addresses this with the Galatian brethren about how they interact with each other when things aren't going as it should. Right after talking about the fruits of the Spirit and the peace that brings and walking by the Spirit, he says in chapter 6, brethren, chapter 6, verse 1, brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass. And there's quite a discussion among commentaries. Does Paul mean caught like caught red-handed, like busted? Or does he mean caught like trapped and like stuck? I would argue that if Paul's a little ambiguous on which one, then maybe what he intends is both, because both can be spiritually fatal. He says, if anyone's caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you will not be tempted. Paul says the same thing. So the goal is restoration, the goal is rescue, and the tone is gentleness. And so Paul sort of helps illuminate even more the principle that Jesus is teaching his disciples and you and I in chapter 18. So back in Matthew chapter 18, it's about a spirit of gentleness. And so if a brother sins, it's not okay to ignore it, because the understanding is that sin is wrong, sin is toxic, that sin is what separates us from God, and sin is what brings death. So why would we think that's okay? I can't imagine a brother walking through a room and he catches on fire and we look and say, ooh, that's going to leave a mark. No, we would jump up, we would respond, we would do the stop, drop, and roll, whether they wanted it or not. In other words, we would recognize that they're in danger. Sin is all the more dangerous than any other thing that we could illustrate. So there is a motivation, but it's about winning one another, to rescue one another, to help each other. And so he says, show him his fault in private. If the goal is to win him, then public humiliation will not accomplish that goal. I'm reminded of how Priscilla and Aquila pulled Apollos aside in the book of Acts and explain to him more perfectly the way of the Lord. They did that privately. Whenever we're corrected publicly and eyes are on us, it's really hard to have a neutral stance. We're too busy being defensive and embarrassed and ashamed that we've got to separate ourselves away from the public eye so that we can process properly what needs to be considered. So that's the goal. It's not about shaming, it's not about humiliation, it's not about destruction, but it's about winning them, about helping them. And so you do that in private. Then he says in verse 16, "But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed." I think sometimes too we misunderstand the idea of 2 or 3 witnesses, that every fact may be confirmed. That, all right, well, so level 2 is full-blown confrontation and prosecution. Well, we're going to lay it out, and here's the facts, and you're going to have to own up to them. No, the goal is still to win them, and as Paul would say, to approach them in a spirit of gentleness and humility. When we have conversations like this, if I'm not wanting to listen, if I want to keep doing what I'm doing, then what you'll normally see happen is, so in the conversation about, brother, I'm concerned about you, this is something you need to consider. If you don't like the message, what do you do to the messenger? We have that old expression, if you don't like the message, you shoot the messenger. So what can happen is, it's not the idea, I don't think, of 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm the fact that they really have sinned and this is what you did and you better repent. Because you're the one that noticed that they are in fault, not the other 2 or 3 people, or they would individually, privately be working out their own conversation. So you're still the sole witness, is the assumption, the sole witness to whatever the fault is here that's being discussed. The purpose of the witnesses is to witness the second conversation, not the original sin or fault, but the second conversation. Because at the second conversation, now, brother, I'm really concerned about you. I think this is something you've got to take seriously. You can't live like this and then expect to be blessed by God. This is not going to be a good place for you. If I don't want to hear that from you, then I'm going to talk about, you got no right to talk to me like that, and who do you think you are? And then because of the typical emotion that's involved, the person that's bringing the information is likely to be attacked and maligned. And then, well, he was mean to me, or he spoke to me this way, or he was really hateful to me, or he said this and said that. It's the confrontational conversation that needs to be witnessed. Because it's typical to shift blame, to attack others, and so on. Now, since this is about rescue, do you notice when Jesus talks about this, he does not say, if you notice someone that's sinning or you see a fault in someone, by all means you need to go tell the elders, or even better, go tell the preacher. Go tell the elders so that they can go talk to him, or go tell the preacher so he can preach a sermon on it. None of that is going to accomplish the goal of winning the brother, right? There's going to be that, besides the open door of, hey, you don't know what really happened because you're not an eyewitness, but you're wide open to, I've been attacked, the tone wasn't right, or the preacher's using the pulpit as a bully pulpit, and there's no relationship in that. So we're going to have to accept the fact that if we're the ones that have noticed, that have gotten involved, that this is a part of God's intent, that I, if I'm the person that noticed, have been placed in that place for a specific reason, that is to rescue the brother. Well, the reason why the second conversation needs to be witnessed and that things need to be kept straight, because it's going to get emotional. There's going to be defensiveness now. There's going to be denial and justification if we get to verse 17. Where Jesus says, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. The whole church needs to know. Not because, well, now you don't belong and you're to be shunned and, the rest of us are perfect and you're not. This is a rescue mission. This is a rescue mission. It's one that makes us nervous. There are various ways, probably social media and text or email or letter is not a great way to do that. But a time for a face-to-face conversation about the health and the well-being of a member. If they're not going to listen to the broader family, they wouldn't listen to two or three brothers, and now they're not going to listen to a broader family. He says, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Which is an interesting thing to say. At first blush, for the Jews, that would have been a kind of shunning, because to be a tax collector or to be a Gentile is, ugh. But we've not seen Jesus act that way. One of the disciples standing there listening, and the author of this gospel is named Matthew, who was a tax collector. The man that Jesus stood in front of his booth and said, come follow me, and Matthew left everything and followed Jesus. So it's not about tar and feathering them. It's not about shunning them or refusing them. So a Gentile is someone who is not in the covenant of God. An older term for you were either a Jew or a Gentile. You were either a people in the covenant of God or you were not. And so there is the idea that there's a consequence, that there's a distance, that they're not a brother in good standing, that they're still in the family, but there's a change because of their rebellion and stubbornness. There's going to be responsibilities and things that wouldn't be right for them to fulfill. But as far as this means that we can't stand him anymore, we're going to shun him, we're not going to talk to him, we're going to completely ignore him, what does Jesus do with Gentiles? What does he call the disciples to do to Gentiles? To reach out to them. And what about tax collectors? Well, the Pharisees got mad at Jesus because he ate with the tax collectors. Now, there is a passage that John writes about in the epistles about not even eating with someone, and he's talking about someone who's specifically denying that Jesus is the Christ. That is an adamant, rebellious, and demonic teaching to reject the sovereignty of the Lord Jesus Christ. And to be teaching that, to be trying to influence others, is to stop that influence. That kind of influence has to be stopped immediately. Someone who's struggling with a fault, someone who's struggling with sin, we all struggle with sin, but someone who is refusing to own up to that fact or work on that fact, that's an entirely different issue than someone who is rejecting or teaching others that Jesus is not the Christ. So you see in Jesus' example how he purposely eats with the tax collectors. It causes great umbrage among the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders, because Jesus would associate with those kind of people. And so a brother who is continuing in stubborn sin is desperately in need of rescue. And so there is this balance between, you can call it tough love if you'd like. Look, now there's some things here that can't be the same. Your responsibilities and your activities as a brother or a sister can't continue since you're not acting like one. But we're not going to ignore them. We're going to give them a lot of attention with a desire to draw them back to the heart of God. Then in verse 18, Jesus continues, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Same thing that Jesus said to Peter earlier in chapter 16. Why would he add that here to this particular context about whatever the rules are in heaven, that's what the rules are here on earth, that don't say anything or do anything more on earth than has already been communicated from heaven? I think it's interesting that in this context of these really difficult circumstances where we're having trouble in our relationships because we're ignoring the truth about God's Word on some particular matter, there's always the struggle when we get emotional of escalation. That whenever we get hurt, we want to hurt back. If we've been humiliated, we want to humiliate back. And so Jesus puts a limitation on this, that even though you've had to go to all this and had to have this conversation with the church and where things are, don't go further than that. Don't go further than what God teaches us. And so an example would be you'd bring in Galatians chapter 6 verse 1 and talk about the tone and gentleness and humility with which that's approached. We don't want to make rules where God is not. And we sure wouldn't want to discipline someone or bring about this process because they're not doing something we want that we don't have book, chapter, verse for. This is such a serious matter. It must not be beyond what we have in Scripture, because escalation is a natural process. It does cause us, and should, hesitation, this kind of painful process in relationship. So look how he encourages us in verse 19 when he says, "Again I say to you that if two of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven." Now this is still in the context of rescue, that there needs to be not just one person's opinion, but there needs to be several people involved, as he says in verse 16, but there is the absolute assumption that there's much prayer in this, and there are multiple voices in prayer, so that our Father's will be done, that we don't slide off into, when we get into one of these difficult emotional kinds of confrontations, that we don't slide off into opinions or personalities. So often disagreements between brethren are not doctrinal, but personal. It might be an application of a doctrine. For example, besides the obvious things about many brethren have damaged their relationships over color of carpets and paint on walls and that sort of thing, which should be obvious. But it's surprising how upset with each other, because what we'll do is, well, they always get their way. They want blue, I want red. Yeah, blue is really because they always get their way and they're tyrants and we're just escalated to where we're talking about the person and not about the paint. But another example would be that we do come together. We come together and celebrate the Lord's Supper. We have communion together. We take of the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine each Lord's Day, as we have the example in the New Testament in the book of Acts, and then Paul talks about the why in 1 Corinthians 11. We do this to proclaim Jesus' death and resurrection. But there are different ways of doing it. And over the years, you hear some interesting things. We happened to be at a church for a while due to the architecture of the room, that the men came up the aisle with the emblems of communion, and then they faced we call him officiator, they faced the guy that was going to give some centering thoughts and lead the prayer. Well, by standing there facing the guy, they have their backs to the congregation. And when we first became a part of that congregation, that was so strange to be looking at someone's back rather than their face. But over time, you get used to it. And I remember then visiting somewhere else, and the guys were facing the church, and oh wow, that's different. And hearing a member say, "Well, you mean they face the congregation? That's not right." What do you mean not right? A lot of churches made the adjustments. Now we have the self-serve communion. We don't have it passed right now. We don't even have the guys up front. That felt weird. So there's an example where we have a doctrinal teaching, this importance about communion, about the Lord's Supper, and about how we commemorate, celebrate, and proclaim Jesus' sacrifice, and the fruit of the vine is His blood, the unleavened bread is His flesh. All of that's the important stuff. And then what happens how are we going to do it? Do we pass it, not pass it? You face the front, you face the back. A classic one is, some people like to sing a song between each element to help focus. Other people think, well, that's distracting. I just need quiet time. And other folks are like, quiet time? Kids are moving, babies are crying. What are you talking about? And so often that's the kind of thing that we get all wrapped around, and sadly can be willing to harm relationships over such things. So when we're going to have these serious conversations, let it be whatever is bound or loosed in heaven, no more, and certainly no less. Let it be when there is much prayer and agreement, knowing that the Father will grant our request. And then the encouragement in verse 20, for together in my name, for verse 24, where there are 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. It's a general truth, but it's interesting that it's in this context that Jesus says, where 2 or more. You mean like the 2 or more that are gathered for the witnesses, the 2 or more that agree? Yes, that Jesus is in our midst, that when we come together for the purpose of rescue, that's exactly what Jesus does. He says in Luke chapter 19, verse 10, the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which is lost and to give his life a ransom for many. That's Jesus' purpose. And if that's our purpose, and we gather in that purpose, then he is in our midst, which means we're going to be granted the gift of strength, the gift of wisdom, and the gift of humility. Well, the disciples hear all this about how we got to talk to folks and how we need to deal with it, and what about those folks that they go astray. And so Peter has a question that he asks for clarification. Verse 21, then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Now I think it's fascinating and probably more natural than we want to accept that as Peter's heard about lost sheep and he's heard about distant brothers and the need to rescue, he has an assumption. And his assumption is, it's not him. It'd been interesting if Peter would have said, Lord, so how often when I sin against my brother should they forgive me? Peter's he's assuming the high ground. He's assuming that he's the innocent party and they've sinned against him. So he's already the magnanimous one. He's already the one that's the spiritual one. So, I mean, how many times should I forgive those who have sinned against me? It's an interesting question to ask given the context that Jesus has been talking about. The stumbling blocks in verse 7, the lost sheep in verse 12, the straying brother in verse 15. And then he says, how often shall I forgive him? Up to 7 times. And see, we know what Jesus is going to say next. He's actually going to say, literally he says 77. And the way he says it, do you mean 77s, which would be 70 times 7, or 70 and 7, which would be 70 plus 7? We know that's coming, so we sort of automatically give Peter a hard time and go, 7, oh my, he is so harsh. But let's just be honest for a moment. Let's sift that for just a second. Let's see. We have a common expression in our culture. We say, you really ought to give somebody a second chance. Yeah, and we pat ourselves on the back. You give somebody a second chance. That's really big. That's just really big-hearted of you. When do we talk about third chances or fourth chances? We even have an expression that goes something like, let's see, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Why would it be shame on me? Well, because you fooled me the first time, you shouldn't have done that. But if you fooled me the second time, shame on me because I shouldn't have let you. Which is not even a second chance. How many times do we forgive folks? Not many at all. And in fact, we live in a climate now due to technology and social media that if you've done something in the past I don't like 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, you're going to hear about it. All I can say is I'm glad my childhood wasn't recorded and my youth wasn't recorded, because there are some things there that I'd still be apologizing for sure. So Jesus responds with 70 times 7, and it doesn't seem that his intent is, okay, good, I got a number. Even if we take 490, I got my little notebook, I put your name next to it and put a little tick mark there, and so on. Is Jesus saying, here's the limit? No, he probably is using the 7s in a Jewish sense. The number 7 to the Jewish mind is a complete number. It's the days of the week, the final day of creation, and so on after the Sabbath. You have 1 Corinthians 13 where Paul explicitly says that love does not keep an account of a wrong suffered, which means if you're keeping score, you're keeping an account, and that's not love. Love doesn't keep track. So if you're thinking, well, it's 490 or 77, you're keeping track. So what Jesus does is gives us a parable. He uses words to paint a picture so that we'll understand it's not a number, but rather it's a matter of the heart. Verse 23, so here comes the illustration. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he had begun to settle them, one of them owed him 10,000 talents. All right, now you may have a little numerical reference there. Some translations will simply say just bags of gold, but as Matthew records this, he uses the specific word talent because there's an amount here that Matthew has in mind. If you do happen to have a marginal note, you can drop down to that note and you can read that a talent was worth more than 15 years' wages of a laborer. In fact, some argue that since this particular, I'm reading out of the New American Standard 1995 edition, well, that over the last 15 years, well, no, it's been the last 25 years now, that you actually got to update that. And so they're actually saying that a talent is more like 20 years' wages. Well, take the 15. Let's be conservative. 15 years' wages, right? But he owed him 10,000 talents. So you got to take 10,000 times 15. Is that 150,000 years or is that 1.5 million years? You're talking about a huge debt, a ridiculous debt. And that's the point. Jesus has given an example of an impossible debt. And there's a twinge here because then you got to ask the question, how does a slave get in that kind of debt? How does he have access to the opportunity to get in that kind of debt? You do know there are cases like Joseph in Potiphar's house that he ran the household, which implies the finances and the books and the flow of the money in and out and the businesses involved with that. The slaves were often put in charge of that. There's another parable or two where the slave is actually the clerk or the manager and doesn't manage it well and so on. So for a slave to get into 150,000 years worth of salary debt, then you got to be talking about some nefarious process. You're talking about embezzlement, theft, so on. So not only is it a staggering amount, a ridiculous amount, it's kind of like what my brain does when we get to trillion. I know on paper that's supposed to be so many zeros, but I can't wrap my head around a billion. I don't know what to do with a trillion. That number's beyond my grasp as far as a practical, emotional application. I don't know what that feels like, for sure. So here's a slave that owns an insane amount of money, and there doesn't seem to be any way that this is an up and up kind of thing. It's not like, well, he's working hard and his business went under. Hey, what can you do? That you can't control the weather. It sounds like there's a lot of guilt in this, that he's guilty for a lot of this debt, not just accidental. So he's called to repay. Verse 25, but since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment be made. Well, he's not worth that much. His whole family's not worth that much. So it's an impossible debt, and it is an absolute dead-end life, because if he's sold off in slavery and all of his family, there's nobody to help him, there's no way out, there's no future. The door just slams shut on his life. Verse 26, the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, and he said, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him the debt, which is incredible. What the Lord is moved by is compassion. Just compassion. There's no way the slave earns this. There's no way that he deserves this. Nothing positive at all, but compassion moves him to release him, to forgive him. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. So denarii is a day's wage. Not 15 years worth of wages, 1 day's worth, 100. So 100 days salary, which is a lot. It's a lot. But it's not an impossible amount. It could be paid back. And that's what the guy asked for. Verse 29, and so his, verse 28, we didn't finish. Who owed him 100 denarii, and he seized him, and he began to choke him and said, pay back what you owe. Now, what's troubling here is that before the conversation even starts, the slave grabs him. It's not like they talk and then they have a disagreement and then it escalates and he finally grabs him, but he starts that way. Now, you remember this context about a lost sheep or about a wayward brother and about go to them in private. If you go to them in private and grab them by the throat, that's not helpful. Why does he start off that way? So aggressive, so brutal. So he begins to choke him, pay back what you owe. And so his fellow slave fell to the ground, began to plead with him, saying, does this sound familiar? Have patience with me and I will repay you. Now, folks, he could have. I don't know his circumstances, but his debt isn't as deep. There's the possibility, and maybe it takes a year or 2 or 5, I don't know. But it is within the realm of possibility. Verse 30, but he was unwilling. See, he was not moved by compassion. He was unwilling, and he went and threw him in prison until he should pay back what was owed. And you don't get paid to be in prison, so he's trapped. He's stuck in a box that he will never be allowed to escape from. What's the hourly rate of being in prison? 0. So how's he going to pay it back? All that does is spread the pain to others, which is exactly what happens in verse 31. So when his fellow slaves saw what happened, they were deeply grieved because a lot of relationships are now being damaged. They came and reported to the Lord all that had happened, and then summoning him, his Lord said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me, just that. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way I had mercy on you? So we read in Galatians 6 verse 1 when Paul says, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in gentleness and with humility. He goes on to talk about the caution lest you too be tempted, because arrogance is, I can't believe you did that. Humility is, wow, but for the grace of God, there go I. That we have just the same capacity and opportunity to make just as big a mess out of our life as someone else. What is it about this parable? What is it about this slave where it goes so wrong? I mean, how does he just walks out of this incredible situation where he's been called to judgment, he's got no hope, he's got no prayer, and he's given this incredible gift of forgiveness, and his reaction is to walk out of that moment and grab somebody by the throat before he starts the conversation, or that's how he starts the conversation, and you better, or else, on such a small thing by comparison. What's going on? It's almost like he leaves an experience of being forgiven and he's angry, that he's already set on go, that he didn't have to get mad, that he was mad, and that he saw a target and went after it. Why? What's wrong? Well, let's go back up. There is a fatal flaw in the man's statement. So let's go back to verse 24, and he owes this 10,000 talents, this incredible burden that has to have come from ugly, wicked activities. And he has no means to repay, so is going to be sold. But look at verse 25. Let's look at his appeal, what he was asking for. Verse 26 rather. So the slave fell to the ground, and he prostrated himself before him, and he said, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. Question. Can he repay a debt of 10,000 talents? No. Like, not even close. Even if the rest of his life he gives up every penny that he ever makes, it won't even make a dent in this debt. So why does he ask that? Why does he say, just give me time and I'll repay it? Why does he ask that? If he really were sorrowful about the mess that he had made, Did you notice that he doesn't ask for forgiveness? He doesn't beg for mercy. He doesn't even apologize. No, in no way does he seem to even accept that he's done wrong. All he says is, give me time and I'll fix it. But he can't fix it. What this means is that the slave is living in denial, that he's unwilling to accept the truth about how bad the mess is. It's not that bad. I mean, but it's not that bad. I'll take care of it. I'll fix it. Don't get in a dither about it. And that is minimizing the truth about how bad this is. That seems to be why he leaves that, because he was forgiven, but he never accepted the grace. If you don't accept how bad your sin is, you don't ever accept the forgiveness because you don't really need it. I mean, maybe a skosh, but not like a lot. And to bring up one sin, you see how this is the fleshing out the challenge of verse 15 about if your brother is in fault. If we don't recognize our own fault, our own sin, hey, why are you talking to me about it? It's not a big deal. You should go talk. You want to talk to somebody bad, you should go over to brother so-and-so, because that guy, let me tell you about that guy. And what we're doing is we're minimizing our own sin. We're justifying our own wickedness. And so what that does is it makes us angry. Why are you talking to me? You should be talking to them. I'm not that bad. Who do you think you are? Let's talk about you for a change. Now you know why you need 2 or 3 witnesses. If the wheels are going to fall off, this is how it can go. And then what happens is the person's angry. Because this slave leaves an incredible moment of forgiveness and never experienced, because he wouldn't accept the grace that was offered. So it actually makes him angry rather than grateful, so that he goes and chokes somebody before he even starts talking. Because he's unwilling to accept the truth about his own state of affairs. All this because Peter said, how many times should I forgive my brother when they sin against me? Jesus is like, I think maybe we need a little adjustment here. Because, we keep score, we keep track of how people have hurt us and how unjustly we've been treated and how unfair, and certainly that can be the case. But how is that compared to all that we've done against God? What debt have we been forgiven? What price has God been willing to pay so that we would not have to pay what we deserve? How is it that we cannot forgive a brother that disagrees over the color of the carpet or how we're going to do communion or whatever else is said, and hurt feelings and bad things and all that, when we are, Isaiah says our righteousness is like filthy rags, when we're a wreck and we're not willing to forgive? Verse 34, Jesus says, and his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him. How much an hour do you get paid to be tortured? Nothing. And he's got a huge debt. So how long will he be tortured until the debt's paid off? Sounds like forever. And so to answer Peter's question, Jesus says in verse 35, my heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. It's got to be real, not just words. This is what Jesus expects of us.